She was sold for just $1, a price that reduced her entire existence to pocket change. The cowboy raised his hand amidst the crowd, his voice cutting through the noise like a thunderclap. My bride. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The spring of 1874 brought little mercy to Dust Haven. The New Mexico sun beat down on the dusty main street where the blacksmith's hammer rang out a steady rhythm, punctuating conversations about the coming railroad that promised to transform their forgotten corner of the territory. The town sat perched between what was and what might be, a collection of weathered buildings, hopeful settlers, and men hardened by frontier life. On this particular afternoon, townsfolk gathered around the sheriff's livestock platform, normally used for auctioning horses and cattle. Today, however, they came for a different spectacle. Clara Mayfield stood with her chin raised, despite the shame burning her cheeks. Her hands were bound loosely before her simple dress torn at one sleeve, evidence of rough handling. Sheriff Boone Carter stood beside her, his cold eyes surveying the growing crowd with calculated satisfaction. "Gentlemen," the sheriff called out, his voice carrying across the dusty square, "we've got ourselves a special item today. This woman needs a husband, and we need her off the town's charity." Laughter rippled through the crowd, sharp as knives. Clara kept her gaze fixed on the distant mountains, refusing to let these strangers see her break. Her fingers trembled slightly, betraying the fear she fought to conceal. "Who'll start the bidding?" Sheriff Boone asked, circling Clara like a predator. "She can cook decent enough. Might even warm your bed, if you're not too particular." More jeers erupted. A miner from the edge of town shouted, "I'll give you 2 bits if she comes with a better dress." The crowd roared. 50 cents if she can shoot straight," another called out. Clara's jaw tightened, but she remained silent, dignity her only shield against their cruelty. The auction continued, a mockery of human decency as men bid pennies amid crude jokes and suggestions. From the back of the gathering, a figure moved forward. The crowd parted slightly as Caleb McGraw approached, his weather-beaten hat pulled low over steady gray eyes. The cowboy's presence brought a momentary hush. He wasn't known for participating in town spectacles. $1, Caleb said, his voice quiet but firm enough to carry. The laughter died instantly. Sheriff Boone's eyebrows rose in surprise. $1, Caleb repeated, reaching into his pocket for the coin. He stepped onto the platform, ignoring the sheriff's calculating stare, and gently took Clara's bound hands in his own. With deliberate care, Caleb raised her right hand. "My bride," he declared, looking directly into her eyes for the first time. The townsfolk of Dust Haven drew a collective breath. In their frontier world of hard bargains and harder hearts, they had just witnessed something unexpected, an act that would ripple through their community in ways none could foresee. Caleb McGraw stood apart from other men in Dust Haven, not just by his weather-beaten hat that had seen too many seasons, or those steady gray eyes that revealed little. It was something more, an invisible line drawn in the dust that folks respected even as they resented it. When he rode into town, conversations would pause, momentarily, before resuming at a more careful volume. The cowboy had earned his reputation through deeds, not words. Once, during a flash flood, 2 springs back, he'd ridden through raging waters to rescue the Wilkins boy when no one else dared. Another time, he'd stood alone against 3 cattle rustlers, refusing to yield even with blood streaming down his temple. His stubborn integrity made him a difficult man to befriend, but an impossible one to corrupt. McGraw keeps to his own code, people would say, their tone hovering between admiration and frustration. This unwritten code had left him wandering from ranch to ranch, bunkhouse to bunkhouse, carrying little more than his saddle and the weight of solitude. The ranch hands respected his work ethic, but rarely penetrated the quiet wall he maintained around himself. At 32, Caleb had watched younger men settle with wives and children while he drifted on. Sometimes, in the deep quiet of night watches, he'd allow himself to imagine a small homestead with smoke curling from the chimney and someone waiting at the door. By morning, he'd have buried such thoughts beneath practical concerns. A man with nothing to his name had no business dreaming of hearth and home. A drifter stays a drifter, he'd mutter to his horse, the only consistent companion he'd known. The animal would flick its ears in what Caleb took for agreement. Yet beneath his stoic exterior lived a hunger for connection that frightened him more than any physical danger. The few who had earned his loyalty, like Old Man Peterson who taught him to read, or Eliza at the general store who saved newspapers for him, knew that Caleb's word, once given, was unbreakable. When he raised Clara Mayfield's hand at that degrading auction, declaring her his bride, Caleb hadn't planned to change his life's trajectory. It had been instinct, a visceral response to cruelty that violated his personal code. But in that moment, he'd shouldered more than the jeers of townsfolk or the burden of another's welfare. He'd allowed himself to reach for something he'd never believed possible, a chance at belonging, at building something lasting in a world that had offered him little permanence. For a man who'd spent years guarding against hope, this was perhaps his most daring act of all. Clara Mayfield stood on the livestock platform, her hands trembling, but her chin lifted in defiance. The jeers of the crowd had cut deep, but she refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. In her 22 years of life, she had weathered storms that would have crushed others, the loss of family, betrayal by those she trusted, and now this public humiliation that threatened to strip away her last shred of dignity. As the auctioneer's voice rang out across the dusty square, Clara's mind raced with memories of her journey to Dusthaven. The promise of work as a seamstress had dissolved into a cruel trap, leaving her penniless and vulnerable in this frontier town, where women without protection were treated as commodities. Yet even as she faced her darkest hour, something fierce burned within her. $1, Caleb McGraw had said, his voice cutting through the mockery, when he raised her hand and claimed her as his bride. Clara felt no fairy tale relief, only a complicated tangle of gratitude and determination. She would not be this stranger's burden. The young woman had survived too much to become another man's responsibility, another mouth to feed without contribution. That night, in the small cabin Caleb had offered, Clara sat alone by the window, watching the stars emerge over the New Mexico landscape. The vastness of the territory matched the emptiness in her chest, yet she found herself planning, calculating, assessing her skills. She could cook, mend, read and write better than most in Dusthaven. These abilities would be her currency now. "I will earn my place," she whispered to the darkness, a promise to herself more than anyone. Clara ran her fingers over the calluses on her palms, evidence of work, of capability, of a strength that couldn't be auctioned away for any price. What the townsfolk had seen on that platform was a woman being sold. What they hadn't seen was her silent vow to transform this humiliation into something of her own making. Clara didn't want rescue. She wanted opportunity, the chance to build something from nothing, to belong somewhere not by charity, but by right. As dawn approached, she made herself a solemn oath. This marriage of convenience would become a partnership of equals, or it would not last at all. Clara Mayfield might have been sold for $1, but her worth was something she alone would determine from this day forward. She would prove to Dusthaven and to herself that she possessed strengths no auction could value and no mockery could diminish. Sheriff Boone Carter watched the auction from the shadow of his office, arms crossed over his chest, eyes narrowed to slits against the harsh New Mexico sun. As the crowd dispersed, murmuring about Caleb's unexpected intervention, the lawman adjusted his badge and strode purposefully across the dusty square. "McGraw," he called, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "A word." Caleb turned, still holding Clara Mayfield's trembling hand. The woman kept her gaze fixed on the ground, her shoulders squared despite her obvious distress. That was quite the spectacle, Sheriff Boone said, his cold calculation evident in every measured word. But I reckon you don't fully understand what you've done here today. The sheriff circled them slowly, boots kicking up small clouds of dust. That wasn't just some theatrical gesture. What you've done is legally binding in the territory of New Mexico. His fingers tapped the revolver at his hip. You've claimed this woman as your bride, and the law expects you to provide for her accordingly. Caleb's weather-beaten face remained impassive, but his gray eyes hardened. I understand my responsibility, Sheriff. Do you? Boone stepped closer. Because Dusthaven doesn't take kindly to men who don't honor their commitments. You've got no proper homestead, barely steady work. His gaze shifted to Clara. And now you've got a wife. The weight of this new reality settled on Caleb's shoulders. What had been a distant dream of family, something he'd imagined on lonely nights in bunkhouses across the territory, had suddenly transformed into an immediate duty. We'll manage, Caleb said simply. Sheriff Boone's laugh held no warmth. You'd better, because if you can't provide, she becomes the town's problem, and I've got enough problems. He adjusted his hat, a public display of power that didn't go unnoticed by the lingering onlookers. I'll be watching you, McGraw. As the lawman walked away, Clara finally raised her eyes. You don't have to do this, she whispered. I never asked to be your burden. Caleb shook his head. You're not a burden, Miss Mayfield. He paused, correcting himself. Mrs. McGraw, I suppose. The name hung between them, foreign and unexpected. I made my choice, he continued. There's no turning back now. Clara studied his face, searching for regret or resentment, finding only quiet resolve. Why? She asked. Why would you do this for a stranger? Caleb looked toward the horizon, where the distant mountains shimmered in the heat. Some things a man just can't stand by and watch. He said finally, not if he wants to live with himself after. They stood together in the square, two strangers bound by a single dollar and a few simple words, while Dusthaven's curious eyes watched from windows and doorways, already placing bets on how long this unlikely union would last. The Vega Ranch sprawled across the eastern edge of Dusthaven, its weathered fences and sturdy barn standing as testament to 3 generations of stubborn perseverance. Caleb McGraw found himself mucking stalls before dawn each morning, his calloused hands working tirelessly for wages that barely kept him and Clara fed. The other ranch hands kept their distance, their sideways glances carrying the weight of town gossip. You work hard enough. Santiago Vega had told him gruffly on the 3rd day, but that wife of yours, she'll need to earn her keep too. Clara Mayfield refused to be a burden. The very next morning, she appeared at the corral, her hair tied back with a faded ribbon, determination etched across her face. I can tend to the horses, she offered, her voice steadier than her hands. My father kept 3 when I was young. The ranch hands snickered, but fell silent when she approached a skittish mare no one had managed to calm. Clara whispered something only the horse could hear, her movements slow and deliberate. Within minutes, the animal was eating from her palm, nuzzling against her shoulder with newfound trust. Well, I'll be, muttered one of the older hands, his weathered face creasing with reluctant admiration. Word of Clara's gift with horses reached Rosalind Vega by midday. The saloon owner arrived at the corral that afternoon, ostensibly to check on ranch business, but her sharp eyes tracked Clara's movements with undisguised curiosity. Most women who come to Dusthaven either have a man or a mission, Rosalind remarked, leaning against the fence beside Clara. You had neither when you arrived. Clara continued brushing the mare, her strokes even and methodical. And yet here I stand. Rosalind's laugh was sudden and genuine. Indeed you do. She studied Clara with newfound interest. My establishment could use someone with your resilience. I prefer the horses, Clara replied, but there was no hostility in her voice. Smart choice. The older woman nodded. Men and whiskey make for poor company most days. That evening, Rosalind insisted the couple take supper at her table, a rare honor that raised eyebrows throughout the ranch. As they ate, the matriarch questioned Clara about her past, her plans, her thoughts on Dusthaven. For once, someone was listening not out of morbid curiosity about the dollar bride, but with genuine interest. When Caleb and Clara walked back to their modest quarters that night, something had shifted. Clara's steps were lighter, her spine straighter. "She respects you," Caleb observed quietly. Clara nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. "Perhaps that's a start." The lantern cast long shadows across the barn's weathered planks as Clara Mayfield's trembling fingers wrapped around the old revolver. She'd found it 3 weeks ago, tucked away in a forgotten trunk beneath hay bales. Every night since then, she'd slip away after Caleb fell asleep, determined to master this tool of protection. "Stand firm, breathe slow," she whispered to herself, mimicking instructions overheard from men at the shooting contests outside town. The firearm felt heavy, foreign in her hands, but less so with each passing night. Clara positioned herself, aiming at a crude target she'd fashioned from sacking cloth. She wouldn't pull the trigger, not here, but she practiced everything else, loading, cocking, steadying her aim. The auction platform's humiliation still burned in her memory. Never again would she stand helpless while men decided her fate. The cold metal against her palm was a promise she made to herself each night. "So this is where you disappear to." Clara whirled around, nearly dropping the weapon. Caleb McGraw stood in the doorway, his tall frame silhouetted against the night sky. She hadn't heard him approach over her concentrated breathing. "I can explain," she said, lowering the revolver slowly. Caleb stepped into the lantern light, his expression unreadable. "That thing's loaded?" "No," Clara answered. "I'm not foolish enough to fire it in a wooden barn." His weathered face softened as he crossed the straw-covered floor. "Where did you learn to handle a firearm?" "Nowhere. Everywhere." She placed the revolver carefully on a barrel. "I watch, I listen, I learn." Caleb nodded, picking up the weapon with practiced ease. "Your stance is wrong. You'd hurt your wrist firing like that." Clara stiffened, expecting ridicule or prohibition. Instead, her husband checked the chamber, confirmed it was empty, and handed it back. "Like this," he said, standing behind her, adjusting her elbows, her grip. "Breathe through the shot. Don't hold your breath." They stood together in the lantern's glow, his hands guiding hers. Clara felt something shift between them. Not romance, not yet, but understanding. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked finally. "Would you have approved?" "Probably not," Caleb admitted. "But I understand why." Clara lowered the firearm. "After what happened at that platform, I won't be powerless again." Her husband's gray eyes met hers. "I have nightmares too," he confessed quietly. "From the war, from trails gone wrong. For the first time since their hasty marriage, they truly saw each other, not as savior and saved, but as two people carrying their own wounds, forging strength from pain." "Tomorrow," Caleb said, "we'll ride out past the Vega property. I'll teach you properly. No secrets between us." Clara nodded, a fragile trust blooming between them, like a desert flower after rain. The iron horse was coming, and with it came Ezekiel Harrow. The railroad foreman strode into Dusthaven like he already owned it, his leather boots leaving imprints in the dust as permanent as the tracks he promised would transform their forgotten corner of New Mexico. Tall and broad-shouldered, with a voice that carried across crowded rooms, Harrow commanded attention without asking for it. "Progress waits for no one," Ezekiel announced at an impromptu town meeting outside the general store. "The Southern Pacific will bring prosperity to those wise enough to embrace it." His promises of wealth and opportunity fell like sweet rain on the parched hopes of many townsfolk. But beneath the promises lay demands. The railroad needed land, specific land, and Harrow had maps marking exactly which properties stood in the way of progress. Caleb McGraw's modest claim, with its small creek and patch of grazing land, sat squarely in the railroad's desired path. $500 for your claim, Harold offered when he visited Caleb's property, the amount hanging in the air between them. More than fair for land this far from anywhere that matters. Clara stood beside her husband, her fingers lightly touching his arm. This land matters to us, she said quietly. The foreman's smile never reached his eyes. The railroad comes whether you sell willingly or not, Mrs. McGraw. Best decide which side of prosperity you want to stand on. After Harold left, Dusthaven began to fracture. At the Silver Spur Saloon, heated arguments broke out nightly between those who saw salvation in steel rails and those who feared losing their independence. Rosalind Vega watched these disputes from behind her bar, calculating where her interests might best be served. "They're offering Jacob Wilson twice what his land is worth," Clara told Caleb one evening as they sat on their porch. "And the Millers sold yesterday." Caleb nodded, his gray eyes fixed on the horizon. "Land's just dirt until you put your heart into it," he said. "Can't put a price on that." Sheriff Boone Carter made his position clear when he posted railroad notices on the courthouse door. "Law's on their side," he warned Caleb after Sunday services. "Don't be the fool who stands in front of a locomotive." But Caleb remained unmoved. This small patch of earth represented everything he and Clara had begun to build together. Not just a home, but a future. Each morning, he walked the boundaries of their claim, mentally reinforcing the invisible lines that separated what was theirs from what others coveted. "We've weathered worse," he told Clara as they prepared for bed, "and we didn't come this far to surrender at the first sign of trouble." Clara squeezed his hand in silent agreement. Their marriage had begun as a dollar bargain, but what they defended now was priceless. The first whispers reached Caleb McGraw while he was mending fence posts at the Vega Ranch. Jonas Pike had returned to Dusthaven, his arrival as sudden as a summer storm. The man who had once ridden alongside Caleb through the territories now slunk through town with shoulders hunched and eyes that never quite met anyone else's. "Your old partner's been talking," Rosalind Vega mentioned casually as she inspected Caleb's work. "Seems he has strong opinions about your marriage." That evening, Caleb found Jonas holding court at the Silver Spur Saloon, his voice carrying above the piano notes. "Marriage of convenience," he was saying, gesturing with his whiskey. "McGraw never cared for anything but his own hide. That woman's just a shield against loneliness." The cowboy stood in the doorway, his gray eyes taking in the scene, former friends now hanging on Jonas's every poisonous word. When Jonas spotted him, a cruel smile spread across his weathered face. "There he is, the great savior of damsels." Jonas raised his glass in mock toast. "Tell us, Caleb, what virtuous impulse made you buy yourself a wife?" The saloon fell silent. Caleb stepped forward, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. "You've been riding too long in the sun, Jonas. It's affected your memory and your manners." Back at their modest home, Clara noticed Caleb's troubled expression immediately. "What happened?" she asked, setting aside the mending in her lap. "Jonas Pike is back," he replied, hanging his hat on the peg by the door. "He's spreading stories about us." Clara's hands stilled. "What kind of stories?" "That our marriage is a sham, that I claimed you for show." Caleb couldn't meet her eyes. "He's bitter, Clara, always has been. Can't stand to see anyone find peace when he can't." Within days, the damage spread through Dusthaven like wildfire. Shopkeepers who had begun to warm to Clara now watched her with renewed suspicion. Women who had nodded in greeting now turned away, whispering behind raised hands. "Mrs. Tanner wouldn't sell me thread today," Clara told Caleb one evening. "Said they were out, though I could see spools on the shelf." The couple found themselves increasingly isolated. Even at the Vega Ranch, workers who had accepted Caleb now kept their distance, their silence heavy with judgment. Yet each night, Clara and Caleb sat together by lamplight, planning their future in quiet voices that refused to be diminished by gossip. They had weathered public humiliation once before. This time, they faced it together. "Let them talk," Clara said finally. her hand finding Caleb's across the table. "We know what's true." The cowboy nodded, his fingers tightening around hers. Jonas Pike might have poisoned the well, but he couldn't make them thirst for approval they didn't need. The skies over Dusthaven darkened without warning, transforming from clear blue to an ominous amber in mere minutes. Clara Mayfield stood in the doorway of their modest dwelling, watching as the massive wall of dust approached from the horizon, swallowing everything in its path. "Get inside!" Caleb shouted over the rising wind, his voice barely audible as he secured the last of their horses in the barn. The storm hit with biblical fury, howling for 3 relentless days. When it finally passed, the residents of Dusthaven emerged to devastation. The Vega Ranch had lost 2 corrals and part of their roof. The Wilsons' entire wheat crop lay flattened, and 3 families found their homes uninhabitable. "We need to help," Clara said firmly, already tying her hair back with a worn cotton strip. Caleb studied his wife's determined expression. "These are the same folks who laughed when you were on that platform. And they'll be the same folks standing beside us when the next storm comes," she replied, her quiet dignity silencing any further argument. The following morning, Clara appeared at the Vega property with Caleb's tools and her own strong hands. Rosalind Vega watched with surprise as the woman began clearing debris without invitation or hesitation. "Didn't expect to see you here," Rosalind remarked, handing Clara a canteen of water. "Storms don't care who they hit," Clara answered simply, wiping sweat from her brow. By midday, 3 other women had joined her efforts. Clara worked tirelessly, hammering boards, hauling water, and comforting children whose toys and security had blown away with the wind. Her hands blistered and bled, but she never complained. At the Wilson farm, she organized a rotation of workers to salvage what remained of their crop. When Old Man Peterson scoffed that women folk should mind the kitchen, Clara merely handed him a shovel and continued directing the recovery efforts. "Never seen anyone work like your wife," Sheriff Boone Carter commented to Caleb as they repaired the damaged water tower. His tone carried reluctant admiration. "She's not what Dusthaven expected," Caleb replied, his pride evident despite his measured words. As weeks passed, the town rebuilt. Neighbors who had once whispered behind Clara's back now greeted her by name. The general storekeeper extended credit without question, and Mother sought her advice on treating minor injuries. One evening, as Clara returned home exhausted from helping raise a new barn, she found a basket on their doorstep. Inside lay fresh bread, preserves, and a handwritten note. "Thank you for showing us what it means to be neighbors." She held the note against her heart, tears welling in her eyes. The woman sold for $1 was slowly becoming something else entirely in Dusthaven. She was becoming necessary. Clara Mayfield's hands trembled as she carefully unfolded the yellow document hidden among the town records. For weeks, she had been slipping into the records office during the clerk's lunch hour, searching for anything that might explain how she had ended up on that auction platform. What she found made her blood run cold. Sheriff Boone Carter's signature was unmistakable at the bottom of the agreement, a contract between him and the traveling auctioneer, detailing how profits would be split from specialty sales. Clara's name appeared in the margins, alongside a notation about expected earnings. The sheriff hadn't merely allowed her humiliation, he had orchestrated it for profit. The revelation struck her like a physical blow. The man who wore the badge of protection had betrayed the very people he swore to serve. Clara pressed her palm against her mouth to stifle a sob. The courthouse walls suddenly felt suffocating, the afternoon sun through dusty windows highlighting the damning evidence in her hands. She carefully refolded the document and slipped it into her pocket. Outside, Dusthaven continued its daily rhythm, the blacksmith's hammer ringing, horses nickering at hitching posts, the distant whistle of surveyors mapping the railroad's approach. None of them knew what she now carried. When Caleb returned from the Vega Ranch that evening, he found his wife sitting motionless at their small table, her face ashen. I know why it happened, she said without preamble. Boone arranged it all. The cowboy removed his hat slowly, gray eyes darkening as Clara explained what she had discovered. His weathered hands clenched into fists, but he remained silent, letting her speak. Everyone looks to him as the law, she continued, her voice growing stronger. But he's nothing but a thief who steals people's dignity instead of their silver. We should leave, Caleb suggested quietly. Start fresh somewhere the railroad hasn't reached. Clara shook her head firmly. Running won't restore what was taken from me. I want the truth known. I want him to face what he's done. Her husband studied her face, recognizing the same quiet determination that had first caught his attention on that terrible day at the auction. It's dangerous to challenge a man with a badge, he warned. More dangerous to let him continue, she countered. Next time, it might be someone without anyone to stand for them. As darkness settled over their modest home, Clara and Caleb McGraw sat together planning how to expose the sheriff's corruption. The path ahead would be treacherous. Boone had allies throughout the territory and the power to make their lives unbearable. But Clara had transformed from the trembling woman on the auction block. She would reclaim her dignity, no matter the cost. The sheriff had made a grave mistake in believing her powerless. The Silver Spur Saloon buzzed with whispers as Caleb McGraw pushed through the batwing doors. Dust from his boots mingled with tobacco smoke hanging thick in the air. He hadn't planned to stop, but the need for information about Ezekiel Harrow's latest land grabs drew him to this den of loose tongues and looser morals. Rosalind Vega nodded curtly from behind the bar, her sharp eyes calculating as always. "Whiskey?" she asked, already pouring before he answered. "Just the one," Caleb replied, scanning the room. At a corner table sat Jonas Pike, cards splayed before him, a smirk playing on his lips as he caught sight of his former trail partner. "Well, if it ain't the gentleman rancher," Jonas called out. "Care to test your luck against real men tonight?" The cowboy should have walked away. Clara would be waiting, worried about his delay. But the eyes of Dusthaven's residents burned into his back, and pride, that damnable companion, rooted his boots to the floor. "One hand," Caleb said, settling into the empty chair. One hand became 3, then 5. Coins clinked against the worn table as the stakes climbed. Men gathered around, their breath hot with anticipation and whiskey. Jonas dealt with flourish, each card slapping the table like a challenge. "Raise," Jonas announced, pushing forward more money than Caleb had earned in 2 weeks at the Vega Ranch. Sweat beaded on Caleb's forehead. He could fold, walk away, but not with the sheriff watching from the bar, not with rumors already circling about his marriage. "Call," he said, matching the bet with nearly everything he carried. The cards revealed their secrets. Caleb's 3 kings against Jonas's 2 pair. "Seems luck favors the married man," Caleb said quietly, reaching for his winnings. Jonas's hand shot out, gripping Caleb's wrist. "Funny how fortune smiles on you these days," he snarled. "First a wife for $1, now this." The saloon fell silent. Even Rosalind paused mid-pour. "Take your hand off me," Caleb warned. "Or what? You'll run home to your auction block bride?" The words hung in the air like gunsmoke. Caleb's fist clenched, but before he could move, Jonas stood, knocking his chair backward. "Tomorrow, dawn, behind the livery," Jonas declared. "Unless you're too domesticated now to defend your honor." Sheriff Boone Carter pushed off from the bar. "I'll witness," he announced, his cold eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "Make sure everything's legal." As the crowd dispersed into murmurs and bets, Caleb gathered his winnings with steady hands that belied his churning thoughts. He'd come for information and would leave with a duel. The weight of his choices, past and present, pressed down on him like the New Mexico sun at high noon. Clara would understand his absence tonight, but would she forgive what tomorrow might bring? The dust settled as Caleb McGraw lowered his firearm, his decision made in a heartbeat that seemed to stretch into eternity. Jonas Pike lay sprawled in the dirt, his own weapon knocked aside, eyes wide with the realization that his life hung by the thread of Caleb's mercy. The crowd that had gathered around the impromptu duel site fell silent, their collective breath held in anticipation of bloodshed. "Get up," Caleb said, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. "This ends now." Jonas scrambled backward, confusion replacing fear. "You could have killed me fair and square." "Fair has nothing to do with it," the cowboy replied, holstering his revolver with practiced ease. "I'm not adding your ghost to my conscience." The onlookers muttered their disappointment. They had come for spectacle, for the satisfaction of seeing frontier justice delivered with gunpowder and lead. Instead, they witnessed something rarer: restraint. Sheriff Boone Carter pushed through the crowd, his cold eyes assessing the situation. "Seems McGraw's gone soft," he announced, loudly enough for all to hear. "Man can't defend his honor, ain't much of a man at all." The words stung, but Caleb kept his expression neutral. He'd lived by his own code long enough to know when others tried to bait him into violence. The sheriff's proclamation, however, spread through the gathering like wildfire, igniting whispers that would soon become town gossip. Rosalind Vega stood at the edge of the crowd, her sharp gaze calculating. "Interesting choice," she remarked to no one in particular. "Mercy in Dusthaven is rarer than gold." By sundown, the story had transformed. What Caleb saw as strength, the town interpreted as weakness. Men at the Silver Spur Saloon spoke in hushed tones about how the cowboy had faltered when faced with a true test. Women gossiped as they collected water, wondering if Clara had married a coward after all. Clara waited for him on their modest porch, her face tight with concern. "I heard what happened," she said as he approached. "Then you heard I didn't kill a man today?" Caleb replied, removing his hat and running a hand through his hair. "I also heard what they're saying." Clara stepped closer, taking his weathered hands in hers. "That you're weak for showing mercy. Let them talk. They will. And it makes our position here more difficult." Her voice remained steady, practical. "People respect strength in this town, and they have a narrow view of what that means." Caleb nodded slowly. "I know, but I'd rather be called weak than become the man they want me to be." Clara squeezed his hands. "Then we'll face it together. This town has already tried to break both of us. They haven't succeeded yet." As night fell over Dusthaven, the couple sat close on their porch, watching distant lanterns flicker in town windows. Their path had grown more precarious, but neither regretted the choice that had brought them here, a choice of dignity over cruelty, of humanity over hatred. The whistle of the locomotive echoed across Dusthaven like a herald of change, cutting through the morning air with its shrill promise. Steel tracks now gleamed where only dust had been, bringing with them a tide of strangers who poured from the train cars with hungry eyes and restless ambitions. Clara Mayfield watched from the edge of their modest property as Dusthaven transformed before her eyes. "They say the general store's doubled its prices since yesterday," Caleb remarked, his weathered hat tilted against the New Mexico sun. "Flour costs more than meat did last month." Clara nodded, observing the workers' children playing near the newly constructed station. They reminded her of herself, displaced, uncertain, seeking solid ground in shifting sands. An idea took root in her mind. The following afternoon, she approached the foreman's wife with a proposition. "Your children need schooling even out here," she explained. "I could teach them their letters, at least until proper arrangements are made." Word spread quickly. 3 days later, Clara found herself seated beneath the shade of an old cottonwood, surrounded by 7 children with dirt-smudged faces and eager eyes. Using slates borrowed from the general store, she guided small hands through the alphabet, her voice steady and patient. "My pa says reading ain't useful for working folk," one boy muttered, his suspicion matching that of many Dusthaven residents toward the newcomers. "Your father is wrong," Clara replied gently. "Words are tools as surely as hammers. They build different things, that's all." As weeks passed, her small class grew. The railroad workers, grateful for someone caring for their children while they laid track, offered Clara payment in food and supplies. She accepted only enough to cover the cost of materials, earning respect that money couldn't buy. Ezekiel Harrow observed her growing influence with calculating eyes. "Mrs. McGraw seems to have found her calling," he remarked to Sheriff Boone Carter one evening outside the Silver Spur Saloon. "Curious how quickly the auction girl has made herself indispensable." The sheriff merely nodded, watching as Clara walked through town, now greeted by name, where once there had been only sneers. For Clara, each lesson was more than letters and numbers. It was reclaiming power that had been stripped from her on that auction platform. Each child who learned to write their name was a small victory against the helplessness she had sworn never to feel again. "You've changed this place," Caleb told her one evening as they sat on their porch, watching lanterns flicker in the growing settlement. Clara smiled, feeling the weight of belonging settle around her shoulders like a shawl. "Perhaps," she replied, "or perhaps Dusthaven is changing me." In the distance, the railroad continued its relentless expansion, bringing both opportunity and threat to their fragile new life. Rosalind Vega studied her reflection in the saloon's dusty mirror, straightening the cameo brooch at her collar. The Silver Spur had been her life's work, built from nothing but determination and the shrewd understanding that men would always need a place to drink away their troubles. Now, with Ezekiel Harrow's proposition, she could ensure her establishment wouldn't just survive the coming changes, it would thrive. "Another whiskey, Mr. Harrow?" she asked, her voice honey-smooth as she refilled the railroad foreman's glass without waiting for his answer. Ezekiel nodded appreciatively. "You understand progress, Mrs. Vega, unlike some in this backward town." He slid a folded document across the polished bar top. "The railroad brings prosperity to those wise enough to align themselves early." The saloon owner's fingers traced the contract's edge. She had watched Clara Mayfield's unlikely rise from auction block humiliation to grudging respect with something like admiration. The girl had spirit, but sentiment was a luxury Rosalind had never been able to afford. "Caleb McGraw has been good to my family," she said, hesitation briefly clouding her expression. "His wife helped nurse my grandson through the fever last month." "And they'll survive," Harrow replied dismissively. "But will they prosper? The question is whether you'll be serving drinks in the town's premier establishment or watching your customers disappear when the main street moves closer to the tracks." Later that evening, Clara arrived at the saloon seeking Rosalind's advice about preserving vegetables for winter. Instead, she found the older woman in deep conversation with Harrow, their heads bent close over maps of the town. The railroad man's finger rested precisely on the plot of land Caleb had worked so hard to maintain. Clara stepped back into the shadows, her heart sinking as she heard Rosalind's familiar voice. "I can convince the town council. They trust my judgment on business matters." When Caleb learned of the betrayal the following day, his weathered face showed no surprise, only resignation. "Folks make choices based on what they think they need to survive," he told Clara as they walked home through the gathering dusk. "Rosalind's just protecting her interests." But Clara felt the sting more sharply. "She was teaching me to run a business. I thought." She stopped, unwilling to admit how much she had craved the matriarch's approval. That night, they tallied their allies on their small kitchen table and found the list alarmingly short. The railroad's influence had divided Dusthaven, turning neighbor against neighbor with promises of prosperity. With Rosalind now firmly in Harrow's camp, doors that had begun to open for them were slamming shut once again. "We're back where we started," Clara whispered, staring at the lantern's flickering light. Caleb reached for her hand across the worn tablecloth. "No," he said firmly. "We have each other now. That's more than either of us had before." The first frost of the season crackled beneath Caleb McGraw's boots as he approached their modest homestead. The morning air carried winter's warning, sharp and unforgiving. Inside, Clara was stoking the fire, her determined movements betraying the worry they both carried. The eviction notice, delivered by one of Ezekiel Harrow's men 3 days prior, lay on their table like a death sentence. "The railroad claims our deed isn't valid," Caleb said, removing his weather-beaten hat. "Harrow's giving us until the first heavy snow to clear out." Clara's eyes flashed with the quiet fire that had first caught his attention. "We won't leave. This is our home." The cowboy nodded, admiring his wife's resolve even as fear gnawed at him. They had built something precious here: a small garden, repaired fences, and most importantly, trust between two wounded souls. The thought of losing it all to Harrow's ambition made his jaw clench. "Judge Thompson says there might be proof in the old town records," Clara said, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. "Records from before the county reorganized." The next morning found them in the dusty back room of the courthouse, poring over leather-bound ledgers and yellowed papers. The town clerk, sympathetic but unhelpful, had given them access but little hope. "Some of these go back 20 years, Clara whispered, her fingers tracing faded ink. "Look for anything with the Henderson name, the man who sold the parcel to you." Hours passed. Outside, clouds gathered, promising the season's first real snow. Caleb's eyes burned from squinting at cramped handwriting, but he pressed on, knowing what waited if they failed. On the third day of searching, Clara's triumphant gasp broke the silence. "Here!" She pointed to a deed transfer dated 15 years prior. Henderson's original claim, with boundaries matching ours perfectly. Caleb studied the document, hope rising cautiously. "This proves the land was properly registered before I purchased it." "And look," Clara added, turning the page, "the railroad's planned route from 5 years ago. It shows they knew about existing claims, but changed their filing to overlap ours deliberately." The couple hurried through the gathering storm to Sheriff Boone Carter's office, document in hand. The lawman's face darkened as he examined their evidence. "Harrow won't like this," he muttered. "Harrow doesn't have to," Caleb replied steadily. "The law is clear." As they left the sheriff's office, the first heavy snowflakes began to fall. Clara slipped her hand into her husband's, both understanding the battle ahead. Their small home waited, its windows glowing with lamplight against the darkening sky, a beacon worth fighting for. The rain beat against the windows of the Silver Spur Saloon as Jonas Pike sat hunched over his whiskey. His face, haggard and drawn, seemed to collapse inward when Caleb McGraw approached his table. The once proud trail rider could barely meet his former partner's eyes. "I need to tell you something," Jonas whispered, his voice barely audible above the patter of raindrops. "Something I've carried too long." Caleb pulled up a chair, his weathered hands flat against the sticky tabletop. The saloon was nearly empty at this hour, with only Rosalind's bartender wiping glasses in the corner. "It was me," Jonas continued, his words tumbling out like stones. "I arranged for Clara to be put up on that platform. I paid off the men who brought her in, convinced Boone to allow it." His fingers trembled around his glass. "I wanted to see you fall, Caleb. I wanted everyone to laugh when you tried to save her." The confession hung in the air between them. Caleb's jaw tightened, his gray eyes darkening with a storm of emotions. All these months, he'd believed Clara's auction had been a cruel twist of fate, not a deliberate trap set by someone he once called friend. Why? The single word carried the weight of betrayal. "Because you always stood tall," Jonas replied, bitter truth spilling from him. "Even when we rode together, folks respected you. They looked right through me. When I heard you were settling in Dusthaven, I couldn't bear it. You finding peace while I drifted." Back at their modest home, Clara sat motionless as Caleb recounted Jonas's confession. Her hands, usually busy with mending or preparing meals, lay still in her lap. The revelation that her humiliation had been deliberately orchestrated, not by strangers, but by someone connected to her husband, cut deeper than the auction itself. "He wanted to use me to destroy you," she said quietly, the realization dawning with terrible clarity. "I should have seen it," Caleb responded. pacing the small room. All those years riding together, I never truly knew him. Clara rose from her chair, her eyes reflecting both pain and resolve. And what will you do now? The question hung between them like smoke. The law offered little recourse. Sheriff Carter had been complicit, and proving malicious intent would be nearly impossible. Yet the knowledge that her suffering had been engineered as a weapon against Caleb opened wounds she thought had begun to heal. "He's taken enough from us," she finally said, her voice steadying. "But what happens next, that's for us to decide, not him." Outside, the rain continued to fall on Dusthaven, washing the streets clean as the couple faced this new revelation that threatened the fragile peace they'd fought so hard to build. The revelation of Jonas Pike's betrayal had left wounds deeper than any knife could cut. Caleb McGraw paced their small homestead, his gray eyes stormy with rage as Clara watched him from the doorway. His hands kept forming fists, then releasing, as though practicing for the confrontation he craved. "I should make him pay," Caleb muttered, his voice low and dangerous. "Make him face every man in town and admit what he did to you." Clara approached her husband slowly, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "And then what? More violence? More shame?" She shook her head. "We've had enough of both to last a lifetime." The morning light caught the determination in her eyes as she continued. "Jonas wanted to destroy us with humiliation. If you confront him with your fists, you'll only give the town another spectacle." Caleb turned to face her, his expression softening. "Then what would you have me do? Let him walk free after what he's done?" "No," Clara replied firmly. "I want justice, not revenge. There's a difference." She moved to the window, gazing toward Dusthaven. "The law that once allowed me to be sold can now protect us both. Sheriff Carter may be corrupt, but the territorial judge arrives next month." The cowboy removed his weathered hat, running fingers through his hair. "The judge might listen, but will the town?" "They're already listening," Clara said. "When I teach the railroad children, their parents speak to me differently now. They see me as more than the woman from the auction block." Over the next days, they began gathering allies. Clara approached Miriam Foster at the general store, who had witnessed Jonas's drunken boasting about the auction scheme. The shopkeeper, once distant, now offered her testimony without hesitation. Caleb spoke with Thomas Weber, the blacksmith who had refused to attend the auction out of principle. The craftsman promised to stand with them before any judge or town meeting. Even young Billy Teague, who delivered messages between ranches, reported overhearing Jonas confess his plot to another drifter at the livery stable. One evening, as they sat reviewing the statements they'd collected, Clara reached for Caleb's hand. "This is how we fight, with truth and dignity, not with violence that would only confirm what they've always thought of us." Caleb squeezed her fingers gently. "You've taught me something I never learned on the trail." "What's that?" she asked. "That sometimes the strongest stand a person can take is refusing to be dragged down to their level." He looked at the papers spread before them. "We'll face them with our heads high." Clara nodded, her voice steady with conviction. "And we'll show Dusthaven that our marriage wasn't born from shame, but from something they can't understand. The courage to begin again." Sheriff Boone Carter stormed into the Silver Spur Saloon, slamming a document onto the bar counter. His face flushed red beneath his badge as he announced to the gathered patrons that Clara and Caleb's marriage was invalid, a mockery of proper procedure that he intended to rectify. "That woman was sold as property, not wed proper," the sheriff declared, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent room. "The territory has standards, even out here." What Boone hadn't anticipated was the reaction his proclamation would receive. Martha Wilson, the seamstress who had once averted her eyes when Clara passed, stood up from her table. "That auction was the mockery, not their marriage," she said firmly. "We all watched and did nothing." One by one, others joined in. The blacksmith recounted how Clara had helped tend his fevered daughter when no one else would approach. The general store owner mentioned how Caleb had rebuilt his storefront after the dust storm without asking for payment. Even old Jebediah, who rarely spoke to anyone, described watching Clara patiently teaching railroad workers' children to read by lantern light. When Rosalind Vega entered, everyone expected her to side with Boone and the railroad interests. Instead, shame etched across her features, she placed herself firmly beside Clara. "I made a mistake choosing power over people," she admitted. But Clara never did, neither did her husband. The sheriff's authority seemed to shrink with each testimony. His fingers drummed nervously against his holster as the crowd shifted toward the couple. Clara stood tall beside Caleb, her hand steady in his. "You arranged that auction," Clara said, her voice clear and unwavering. "You profited from my humiliation. But look around you now, Sheriff. Dust Haven isn't yours to control anymore." Ezekiel Harrow burst through the saloon doors, expecting to find allies. Instead, he encountered a united front of townspeople, merchants, ranchers, and laborers standing shoulder to shoulder with the couple he'd tried to displace. "The railroad doesn't need your approval," Harrow blustered, but his words fell flat in the charged atmosphere. Caleb stepped forward, his gray eyes steady. "Maybe not, but it seems you'll need to find another route through town." As Boone and Harrow retreated from the saloon, the balance of power in Dust Haven visibly shifted. The couple who had once been objects of mockery and suspicion now stood at the center of a community finding its conscience. Clara squeezed Caleb's hand, feeling for the first time that they truly belonged, not just to each other, but to this place and these people who had finally chosen to stand for what was right. The courthouse creaked with age as Caleb McGraw stood before Judge Wilson, clutching the yellowed land deed in his weathered hands. Dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight streaming through the high windows, and the scent of old paper and ink hung heavy in the air. The wooden benches were packed with townsfolk, their whispers creating a restless undercurrent as Sheriff Boone Carter sat smugly beside Ezekiel Harrow and their lawyer. "This document clearly states my grandfather's claim to the Eastern Quarter," Caleb declared, his steady gray eyes never wavering. "The land has passed legally to me. Railroad plans are not." Clara sat in the front row, her back straight as a fence post. She had spent 3 sleepless nights helping her husband search through moldering town records until they'd found the crucial document. The young woman caught Rosalind Vega's eye across the room. Noting how the saloon owner quickly looked away, shame evident in her posture. Sheriff Carter rose to his feet, his voice booming through the cramped space. "McGraw's claim is questionable at best. A drifter suddenly producing convenient paperwork shouldn't outweigh progress." "That drifter has worked honest days for years in this town," called out old Mr. Jameson from the back. "Unlike some who profit from others' misfortune." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Clara felt a surge of gratitude as faces that once looked at her with mockery now showed support. She remembered standing on that auction platform months ago, humiliation burning through her veins. Now, these same people were standing with them. Judge Wilson examined the document carefully, holding it to the light. The seal appears authentic. The boundaries match county records. Harrow's lawyer jumped to his feet, arguing technicalities and invoking eminent domain. But the judge raised his hand for silence. The railroad's claim relies on Sheriff Carter's assertion that this land was abandoned. Clearly, he gestured toward the document. It was not. Clara watched Boone's face darken with anger. The man who had orchestrated her sale, who had tried to strip away her dignity, was finally facing justice of his own. "This court recognizes Caleb McGraw as the rightful owner," Judge Wilson declared, bringing down his gavel with finality. The courthouse erupted in cheers. Caleb turned to Clara, his eyes bright with unshed tears. She rose and took his hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of hard work and unwavering determination. As they stepped into the afternoon sunlight, townsfolk clapped Caleb on the back and nodded respectfully to Clara. They had won more than land today. They had claimed their place in Dusthaven, transforming from outsiders to neighbors worth fighting for. The echoes of that cruel auction day had finally been silenced, replaced by the sound of a community acknowledging its better nature. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by a breathless boy from the general store. Clara Mayfield McGraw unfolded the paper with trembling fingers while Caleb stood beside her, his weathered hand steady on her shoulder. The news spread through Dusthaven like wildfire. The railroad had failed to secure land rights in the capital, forcing them to reroute the tracks 20 miles south. "They're bypassing us entirely," Caleb said, his gray eyes scanning the horizon where construction had already halted. The abandoned railroad camp stood like a ghost town at the edge of their property. Ezekiel Harrow departed without ceremony, his grand promises evaporating like morning dew. Sheriff Boone Carter remained, though his influence had diminished considerably after the courthouse hearing exposed his involvement in Clara's auction. The lawman now avoided the couple's gaze when they passed on the dusty main street. That evening, townsfolk gathered at the Silver Spur Saloon, voices hushed with worry about Dusthaven's future. Rosalind Vega served drinks with a tight smile, her gamble on railroad prosperity having failed spectacularly. When Clara entered, conversations paused. The saloon owner approached her former protégé with hesitation. "I made the wrong choice," Rosalind admitted, pride giving way to pragmatism. "This town needs people who stand their ground." The first snow of winter arrived that night, transforming Dusthaven into a canvas of white. By morning, the modest cabin Caleb had expanded with his own hands stood like an island in a sea of pristine snow. Clara stepped onto their porch, wrapping a woolen shawl around her shoulders. "Do you regret staying?" she asked, as her husband joined her, steam rising from the coffee mug in his hand. Caleb shook his head. Not for a moment. They had planted winter wheat in the south field, following advice from the Vega ranch hands, who had come to respect the couple's tenacity. Their barn housed 3 horses now, and a small vegetable garden lay dormant beneath the snow, waiting for spring's return. "We might not have the prosperity the railroad promised," Clara said. "But we have something better." In the distance, smoke rose from chimneys throughout town. Children's laughter echoed as they played in the fresh snow. Jonas Pike had left Dusthaven weeks ago, seeking redemption elsewhere, after his confession had cleared the air between old friends. Caleb took Clara's hand, the same hand he had raised on that auction platform seasons ago. Their fingers intertwined, no longer strangers bound by a dollar transaction, but partners who had weathered storms together. "This is ours," he said simply, gesturing to their modest homestead. Clara nodded, understanding the weight of those words. In a town that had once seen her as property to be sold, she now stood as landowner, teacher, and respected neighbor. The roots they had planted ran deeper than any railroad ties could have reached.